switch gears and talk about South African independence. South Africa existed from 1910 as a dominion of Great Britain, meaning it was about the same level of independence as Canada or Australia. Even though it was independent, the native Africans were still colonized through the system of apartheid. Discriminatory laws had been on British books in South Africa since the 19th century, but the segregation became more intense after World War II. 1948 was a key year for South African politics. The Afrikaner National Party that campaigned under the slogan Apartheid won the election and formally created the white segregationist government. Keep in mind that this was not unusual for the time period. Governments across Africa were ruled by white imperialists, and the United States was still in the era of Jim Crow. The National Party's plan was not just to separate white and black people, that was already happening, but to separate the different races from each other and to divide the black community among tribal lines to decrease their political power. Eventually, all South Africans were categorized into 4 races: white, black, colored, kind of like mestizo, mixed race, and Asian. There were a lot of Indian and Pakistani people in South Africa because of the Indian diaspora in the late 19th century. Remember, Gandhi was in South Africa at one point? In 1959, a sociologist became leader of South Africa, and he took the government to another level. He decided that the only way for South Africa to be successful was to unscramble the region by organizing all of the different groups into different geographic areas. This is called social engineering, and it's the kind of thing that might sound logical on paper, where you can ignore the vastly upsetting human experiences that come with forced relocation. This process geographically segregated South Africa. People of color were forcefully evicted and sent to their, quote, homelands, although some people had never lived there in their entire life. Non-whites had to carry identification that would authorize their presence in restricted zones, which were basically any part of the country that wasn't the, quote, homeland. There were pass laws, and those would be hotly protested. 80% of the land in South Africa was reserved for whites, even though they made up only 19% of the population. Up until 1960, most of the world didn't pay much attention to what was going on in South Africa because what they were doing was relatively common. It was not okay or justified, but it was also not unusual. But in 1960, the world started paying attention. In Sharpeville, around 6,000 protesters marched on a police station to protest the pass laws. The South African police fired into the crowd, killing dozens, including 29 children. Photographs of the Sharpeville Massacre were published around the world, including ones of young people being shot in the back as they fled police. International outrage led the United Nations to begin the process of condemning the apartheid government. In 1973, a UN resolution identified apartheid as, quote, a crime against humanity. They called for an embargo, especially on weapons, against South Africa. 91 member states voted in favor and 4 against, the 4 being South Africa, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And South Africa was suspended from the United Nations. Interestingly, South Africa reacted by strengthening its ties to Israel, who also helped them develop their own weapons manufacturing program. Israel also had some experience with being a lonely country amidst hostile neighbors, so knowing how to make your own weapons was a pretty useful skill. The South African team was also banned from the 1964 Olympics after Interior Minister de Klerk, who ironically would become the South African leader that ended apartheid, insisted that their teams would not be racially integrated. The International Olympic Committee was considering letting them back in for the 1968 Games, but a proposed boycott by other African nations ended this idea. It's kind of a cool example of the ideological impact of people like Gandhi and Dr. King spreading around the world. Who needs guns when you can boycott? Passive resistance to apartheid was initiated by the African National Congress with its Defiance campaign in the early 1950s. Subsequent protests targeted curfews, pass laws, and segregation in public facilities. Some anti-apartheid demonstrations resulted in widespread rioting. One of the more notable incidents was the Soweto Uprising in 1976. Black South African high school students in Soweto protested against the Afrikaans Medium Decree of 1974, which forced all black schools to use Afrikaans and English in a 50-50 mix as languages of instruction. The association of Afrikaans with apartheid prompted black South Africans to prefer English. Even the Bantustan regimes chose English and an indigenous African language as official languages. In addition, English was gaining prominence as the language most often used in commerce and industry. The 1974 decree was intended to forcibly reverse the decline of Afrikaans among black Africans. The decree was resented deeply by the black populace. Desmond Tutu, Bishop of Lesotho and later Dean of Johannesburg, stated that Afrikaans was, quote, the language of the oppressor. Teacher organizations, such as the African Teachers Association of South Africa, objected to the decree as well. The resentment grew until April 30th, 1976, when children at Orlando West Junior School in Soweto went on strike, refusing to go to school. The rebellion then spread to many other schools in Soweto. On the morning of June 16, 1976, between 10,000 and 20,000 black students walked from their schools to Orlando Stadium for a rally to protest against having to learn through Afrikaans. Many students who later participated in the protest arrived at school that morning without prior knowledge of the protest, yet agreed to become involved. The protest was planned by the Soweto Students' Representative Council, SSRC, Action Committee, with support from the wider Black consciousness movement. Teachers in Soweto also supported the march after the Action Committee emphasized good discipline and peaceful action. The crowd of between 3,000 to 10,000 students made their way towards the area of the school. Students sang and waved placards. The police set their trained dogs on the protesters, who responded by killing the dog. The police then began to shoot directly at the children. The police attacks killed 23 people on the first day in Soweto. The violence escalated as bottle stores and beer halls, seen as outposts of the apartheid government, were targeted, as were the official outposts of the state. The violence abated by nightfall. Police vans and armored vehicles patrolled the streets at night. Emergency clinics were swamped with injured and bloody children. The police requested that hospitals provide a list of all victims with bullet wounds to prosecute them for rioting. Hospital administrators passed this request to the doctors, but the doctors refused to create the list. Doctors recorded bullet wounds as abscesses. The Soweto Uprising was condemned by the United Nations and the international community, but apartheid ruled South Africa until 1991. Between 1987 to 1993, the National Party entered into bilateral negotiations with the African National Congress, the leading anti-apartheid political movement, for ending segregation and introducing majority rule. In 1990, prominent ANC figures such as Nelson Mandela were released from prison. Apartheid legislation was repealed in June 1991, pending multiracial elections held under a universal suffrage set for April 1994. And who was elected the first president of the desegregated, de-apartheid South Africa? Nelson Mandela. That was a big deal. I remember that in school. That was a big deal. Again, the fact that an American kid knew the name Nelson Mandela in 1994, I was like in 5th grade, right? 5th or 6th grade. That was a big deal. Now, for this lecture, we've only given a few specific examples, and they were mostly from French and British imperialism. What about Spain and Portuguese colonies in Africa? Why were they so slow to decolonize? The dictatorial regimes were the only colonial powers still remaining in Africa in the mid-1960s. Spain's territories were relatively minor, but they did grant independence to Equatorial Guinea in 1968. For a time, the Spanish held on to the Spanish Sahara, immediately south of Morocco, which possessed valuable deposits of phosphates, a natural fertilizer. Portugal's colonies, Guinea, Mozambique, and Angola, waged all-out wars for independence. By the early 1970s, more than half of Portugal's national budget supported the military forces in Africa. Eventually, the Portuguese army and people rose in revolt. One of the first actions of the new Portuguese government was to recognize nationalist claims for the independence of their territories. Thus, by the 1970s, more than 70 African nations gained their independence, with more on the way, as we know, looking back in history. But it's interesting to see how in different regions, independence played out in different ways. The role that violence played, both from a colonial perspective and from the anti-colonial perspective as well. So we've come to the end of the decolonization lecture.